Behind the dazzling smiles of the 1960s to the 1990s lay a truly dark reality. Millions adored these legendary British idols, yet behind closed doors, their devoted partners lived in gilded cages. Consumed by a suffocating syndrome of obsessive jealousy, these famous men transformed romance into a relentless psychological fortress. Who were these charming gentlemen hiding such a controlling shadow? Subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below with your thoughts as we reveal the hidden truth of these captured hearts. Richard Burton, a voice that could shake the rafters of any theater and a gaze that melted hearts across the globe, masked a profound insecurity within this Welsh titan. He was celebrated as the ultimate romantic conqueror of the 20th century, yet his most legendary love affair was built on a foundation of fierce possessiveness. While the world watched in awe as he showered his iconic bride with the most magnificent gems on earth, few realized these glittering diamonds functioned as elegant, heavy chains. His love was not a warm embrace, but a relentless siege demanding absolute surrender. The moment their eyes met on a legendary film set in 1962, a tempestuous bond was forged that would ultimately devour them both. He demanded nothing less than her undivided attention at every waking moment, viewing any interaction with others as a direct insult to his pride. If she so much as shared a polite laugh with a co-star, his temper would ignite into a terrifying storm of accusations and deep despair. He needed to be the absolute center of her universe, systematically building an invisible fortress around her and carefully monitoring their private domain. This suffocating dynamic meant that despite being one of the most photographed women on the planet, she lived a life of intense emotional confinement. He would endlessly interrogate her about her past romances, picking at old wounds and demanding reassurances that he was her ultimate love. His anxious phone calls would interrupt her days whenever they were apart, creating an atmosphere of constant, exhausting scrutiny. He expected her to simply become an extension of his own grand persona, lingering in his shadow and effectively erasing her independence piece by piece. To cope with the immense pressure of his relentless suspicions, their household frequently descended into chaotic nights fueled by strong beverages and bitter arguments. The cycle was always the same, consisting of a fierce eruption of baseless jealousy, followed by dramatic apologies and the presentation of yet another historic jewel. He mistakenly believed that financial extravagance could somehow bandage the deep emotional wounds his controlling nature inflicted upon her spirit. It was a tragic display of a man trying to purchase the loyalty he was too terrified to simply trust. Ultimately, this overwhelming wave of possessiveness became the very force that shattered their extraordinary, twice-attempted union. The endless cycle of fierce accusations proved too draining to sustain over the decades, forcing her to finally break free from his crushing grasp. He loved her with a ferocity better suited for a classical tragedy, forgetting that a real partnership requires breathing room. The public saw a master of the silver screen, entirely unaware of the frantic, jealous man pacing the floors in the dead of night, destroyed by his own insecurities. Peter Sellers. The world wept with laughter at the bumbling characters he famously portrayed throughout the 1960s and 70s, yet his private reality was devoid of any comedic relief. Behind the master of 1,000 voices hid an incredibly fragile ego, terrified of abandonment and consumed by dark suspicions. For the beautiful women who walked down the aisle with him, the fairy tale romance vanished almost instantly, replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of intense paranoia and rigid control. His approach to marriage was less about forming a loving partnership and more about acquiring a beautiful possession that he could entirely mold to his will. The moment he secured a new bride, particularly his famous Swedish wife in the mid-1960s, a metaphorical cage descended around her. He demanded she abandon her promising acting career to serve merely as his beautiful companion, strongly forbidding her from taking roles that involved embracing other men on the silver screen. The sheer unpredictability of his temper meant his partners were forced to walk on fragile eggshells every single day, terrified of triggering his volatile nature. If a waiter simply smiled at his wife during a dinner date, he would construct elaborate delusions of infidelity in his mind, punishing her with days of crushing, icy silence. He systematically isolated his spouses from their trusted friends and families, ensuring they had absolutely no outside support to question his behavior. To further his absolute domination, he resorted to invasive surveillance tactics that turned their luxurious homes into frightening emotional prisons. He was known to secretly record private telephone conversations to scour for any hint of betrayal, listening to hours of innocent chatter with an obsessive intensity. His deep jealousy even extended to his own children, viewing the natural affection his wives showed them as a direct theft of the devotion he felt he exclusively deserved from her. Whenever a partner desperately tried to escape his controlling grasp, he would resort to alarming theatrical displays of profound sorrow, manipulating their deep empathy to make them stay. These emotional traps forced terrified young women to remain in deeply unhappy unions, completely drained of their own vibrant identities and spirit. The public continued to celebrate his undeniable comedic genius, entirely unaware of the psychological destruction he consistently left behind locked doors. The ultimate tragedy of his turbulent existence was that his desperate, crushing grip destroyed the very affection he craved more than anything else in the world. His marriages collapsed one after another, leaving a trail of broken hearts and lasting emotional trauma among the women who had truly loved him. He remained a brilliant artist on camera, but a permanent captive of his own devastating jealousy in reality, forever chasing a perfect loyalty that his own actions made utterly impossible. John Lennon, the voice of a generation promoting universal peace, hid a turbulent, deeply possessive reality behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Before the world fully grasped the magnitude of his musical revolution in the early 1960s, he had already built a quiet, invisible cage for his first great love. The young art student who captured his heart found herself navigating a perilous emotional landscape where his fierce devotion constantly threatened to transform into a blinding, destructive jealousy. The unprecedented global frenzy surrounding his band forced his young bride into a bizarre, enforced isolation. While he traveled the globe experiencing the wild adulation of millions, she was strictly instructed to remain hidden away in their suburban home, entirely erased from his public narrative. He justified this secrecy as a professional necessity, yet it perfectly suited his overwhelming desire to keep her safely tucked away from the prying eyes of other men and potential rivals. His deep-seated fear of abandonment manifested as an intense policing of her appearance and daily movements. He strictly forbade her from wearing garments that he deemed too alluring and heavily criticized any application of cosmetics. If she merely danced with an old friend at a social gathering, his temper would erupt into a terrifying display of bitter resentment. He constantly projected his own insecurities onto her, demanding an absolute, unquestioning loyalty that no human could sustain. This suffocating atmosphere left her feeling utterly trapped, raising their child in the lonely shadow of his monumental fame. She absorbed his unpredictable moods and frantic outbursts, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid triggering his deeply ingrained paranoia. Even as he preached love and understanding to stadium crowds, he struggled to offer those same virtues to the woman waiting faithfully by the fireside. His emotional control was a heavy, invisible chain that bound her completely. To the outside world, she was the incredibly fortunate woman who held the heart of a musical genius, yet the reality was profoundly isolating. She was systematically stripped of her own vibrant identity, entirely overshadowed by his colossal presence and endless emotional demands. She learned to exist quietly in the background, carefully avoiding any action that might awaken his volatile, jealous nature. Her silent endurance painted a tragic portrait of a love entirely eclipsed by obsessive control. Decades later, he bravely confessed to the profound cruelty of his youthful possessiveness through his most vulnerable songwriting. He openly admitted that his desperate need to physically and emotionally confine his partner stemmed from a profound, terrifying insecurity. While his later years demonstrated a genuine quest for personal growth and spiritual redemption, the quiet sorrow of his first wife remains a poignant reminder of the heavy toll exacted by an idol consumed by the green-eyed monster. Rex Harrison. An aristocratic elegance and a commanding theatrical presence defined his image as the ultimate English gentleman of the silver screen. Millions of fans swooned over his perfectly tailored suits and crisp, lyrical delivery that dominated the mid-20th century. Yet, beneath the polished exterior of this celebrated knight of the realm lurked a chillingly cold and fiercely demanding tyrant. His legendary charm was carefully weaponized to establish absolute dominance over the women who loved him. He approached the sacred institution of marriage not as a romantic partnership, but as an ongoing audition where his spouse was expected to play a subservient, supporting role. Across his 6 highly publicized unions, a dark and consistent pattern emerged of intense psychological control. The moment he secured a new bride, he expected her to entirely abandon her own ambitions and orbit solely around his monumental ego. Any independent success she achieved was viewed as a direct, jealous threat. His particular brand of possessiveness was rarely expressed through fiery, physical outbursts, but rather through a persistent, icy, and deeply critical psychological warfare. He would casually dismiss the opinions of his wives, harshly critique their appearances, and systematically isolate them from any supportive colleagues. By steadily dismantling their self-esteem, he ensured they felt entirely reliant on his unpredictable flashes of approval, trapping them in a sophisticated emotional cage. During the 1960s, his union with a brilliant, fiery Welsh actress became the most tragic example of his suffocating domestic regime. Her own formidable talent was systematically crushed under the heavy weight of his profound arrogance and constant, subtle belittling. He openly resented her professional accolades, creating an atmosphere of intense anxiety where she constantly sought his validation. She was forced to navigate a minefield of his changing moods just to keep the peace. If she dared to challenge his absolute authority or sought emotional warmth, he would punish her with days of deafening, impenetrable silence. This cruel emotional withdrawal was deliberately designed to induce a state of desperate panic, forcing her to beg for his forgiveness for entirely imagined slights. The immense pressure of living in this beautiful, gilded nightmare eventually drove her to a devastating emotional collapse. Her story concluded with profound sorrow and a tragic early end. He famously refused to accept any genuine responsibility for the immense emotional destruction he caused, smoothly moving on to his next territorial acquisition. The glamorous parties he continued to host were masterclasses in public performance, successfully masking the deep misery he inflicted upon his partners. The world continued to enthusiastically applaud the masterful actor, completely blind to the hollow, broken spirits he left behind. His legacy remains a grim testament to quiet cruelty. Sean Connery, the defining cinematic spy of the 1960s, projected an image of rugged masculinity and effortless, unshakable confidence. He set the international standard for suave sophistication, making millions swoon with his iconic Scottish charm and commanding physical presence. Yet, the reality of his domestic life revealed a man deeply bound by highly restrictive, archaic views on romantic partnerships. His intense desire to control his environment extended with a heavy hand into his first marriage. He held firm beliefs that a husband was the absolute ruler of the household, and any deviation from this dynamic was fiercely discouraged. When he married a highly successful and fiercely independent Australian actress, the clash of their strong personalities ignited a remarkably volatile atmosphere. He was intensely jealous of her prior worldly experiences, her established career, and the natural attention she commanded. He expected her to willingly shrink herself to fit neatly within his massive shadow. His jealousy frequently manifested as a dark, brooding resentment that cast a suffocating gloom over their daily existence in the mid-1960s. If she accepted a prominent film role that required her to travel or work alongside other leading men, his displeasure was made coldly clear. He genuinely believed her primary duty was to maintain his grand home, viewing her artistic ambitions as an unnecessary distraction. This fundamental lack of respect for her individuality bred deep bitterness. The atmosphere within their shared residence was often described by those close to them as walking blindly through a field of hidden emotional landmines. She found herself constantly monitoring his shifting, unpredictable moods, altering her own behavior to avoid triggering his deeply ingrained insecurities. He sought to dictate their social calendar and scrutinized her friendships with an almost investigative intensity. The freedom she had once enjoyed as a celebrated artist was steadily eroded. He rarely made any public effort to hide his antiquated views, openly expressing opinions during television interviews that shocked even his most loyal supporters. He genuinely believed his domineering behavior was completely justified, confusing his fierce possessiveness with a traditional sense of masculine protection. This steadfast refusal to evolve or recognize the emotional weight he was inflicting made the psychological confinement of his partner feel hopelessly permanent and utterly exhausting. The glamorous international facade successfully masked a turbulent and deeply unhappy reality that eventually culminated in a highly publicized, bitter separation. She was left to rebuild her fractured confidence after years of enduring his relentless need for absolute domestic supremacy. He remained a universally adored global icon of rugged charm, celebrated by millions until his final days. Meanwhile, the private truth of his early romantic life stood as a stark reminder of the dark side of devotion. George Best. Known universally as the fifth Beatle of the football pitch, this Northern Irish athletic genius captivated the 1960s with his dazzling footwork and striking good looks. He possessed a level of fame previously unseen in the sporting world, adored by millions of frantic supporters who chanted his name from the terraces. Yet, behind the triumphant goals and the endless flow of glamorous parties, a deeply troubled man wrestled with fierce personal demons and an overwhelming, crushing jealousy. When he married a stunningly beautiful English model in the late 1970s, the stark contrast between his public persona and private reality became painfully clear. While he notoriously indulged in every temptation the nightlife had to offer, he demanded absolute, puritanical devotion from his new bride. He was utterly terrified that she would attract the same kind of attention he so freely sought for himself, transforming their luxurious shared home into a heavily guarded golden fortress. His possessiveness frequently spiraled into dark, paranoid delusions fueled by his ongoing reliance on strong, intoxicating beverages. If they ventured out in public and another gentleman merely glanced in her direction, his legendary charm would instantly evaporate, replaced by a terrifying, brooding fury. He would drag her away from social gatherings without a single warning, hurling baseless accusations of infidelity that left her feeling entirely isolated, profoundly confused, and deeply frightened. To maintain his fragile sense of absolute dominance, he began to strictly dictate her wardrobe and aggressively monitor her daily routines. The vibrant, independent woman he had initially pursued was systematically pressured to dim her own natural light so he could remain the undisputed star of their tumultuous household. She was expected to endure his chaotic disappearances and public scandals with quiet dignity, whilst her own innocent friendships were subjected to his relentless, suspicious interrogations. She poured her heart into trying to rescue him from his self-destructive habits, yet her immense loyalty was rewarded only with further restrictions on her personal liberty. He viewed her attempts to establish boundaries as a direct threat to his authority, tightening his emotional grip whenever he felt his chaotic world slipping out of his hands. The very love she offered became a weapon he used against her, manipulating her deep empathy to ensure she remained firmly trapped within his unpredictable orbit. The immense psychological toll of managing his spiraling paranoia ultimately proved entirely unsustainable for his exhausted partner. She finally gathered the immense courage required to walk away from the crushing weight of his monumental shadow, choosing her own sanity over his endless, jealous demands. The sporting world continued to mourn his squandered potential and celebrate his glorious triumphs on the grass, largely ignoring the silent, heavy tears shed behind the locked doors of his private estate. Oliver Reed, the ultimate hellraiser of the British silver screen, a man whose brooding intensity and raw magnetism made him an unforgettable force in the 1960s and 70s. He famously cultivated an aura of absolute danger, frequently embracing a spectacularly chaotic public lifestyle that terrified and mesmerized the public. Yet, the women who dared to share his private world discovered that his fiercely protective nature masked a deeply terrifying, suffocating possessiveness. Entering a romantic union with this formidable giant meant accepting a set of incredibly rigid and archaic domestic rules. He firmly believed in an entirely patriarchal system, where his word was absolute law and his partner was expected to cater to his every unpredictable whim. While he roamed the globe creating legendary tales of mischief and indulgence with his fellow actors, his significant other was expected to remain quietly at their grand estate, serving as a loyal, unquestioning anchor. His fierce jealousy was legendary amongst his close associates, bubbling just beneath the surface of his boisterous charm. If a courageous gentleman dared to look in the direction of his companion during a social event, the atmosphere would instantly chill to a freezing point. He used his immense physical presence to intimidate anyone he perceived as a threat, treating his partner not as an equal, but as an extraordinarily valuable piece of property that required his constant, aggressive guarding. To maintain his absolute dominion, he employed a powerful mixture of overwhelming charisma and sheer psychological dominance. He would frequently dismiss the personal ambitions or independent thoughts of the women he loved, burying their identities under the immense weight of his colossal personality. They were trapped in a bewildering cycle, forced to navigate his monumental, thundering rages, which were inevitably followed by periods of intense remorse and suffocating, overwhelming affection. The psychological toll of living alongside such a beautifully destructive force was profound and incredibly isolating for his captive partners. He actively discouraged them from maintaining strong friendships outside of his carefully controlled circle, fearing that outside influence might encourage an uprising against his strict regime. The immense pressure to perfectly play the role of the devoted, submissive muse drained their spirits, turning their romance into a heavily guarded emotional prison. Even as he aged and the wilder edges of his youth began to slowly soften, the core of his fiercely territorial nature remained firmly intact until his very last days. He was a man who loved with the destructive power of a hurricane, fundamentally incapable of offering the gentle trust that a healthy romance truly requires. The world remembers a magnificent, roaring lion of cinema, conveniently ignoring the silent cages he meticulously built for the women who held his turbulent, restless heart. John Osborne, the pioneering playwright who famously defined the angry young men movement of British theatre, possessed a brilliant mind that masked a profoundly toxic, intensely insecure heart. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, his revolutionary dialogue electrified the stage, earning him international acclaim as a literary genius. Yet, the women who stood by his side quickly realized that his immense vocabulary was frequently weaponized behind closed doors to establish absolute, terrifying psychological dominance. His approach to romantic partnerships across his 5 turbulent marriages revealed a dark, consistent pattern of extreme possessiveness and cruel emotional control. He actively pursued fiercely intelligent and talented women only to systematically dismantle their confidence the moment the honeymoon period formally concluded. He viewed their independent successes in the acting and writing worlds not with pride, but as direct, jealous threats to his undisputed position as the intellectual master of their shared domain. To maintain his absolute authority, he resorted to an incredibly sophisticated and devastating form of quiet domestic warfare. Rather than relying on loud intimidation, he used his supreme command of the English language to craft deeply insulting, heartbreaking letters addressed to his own wives, delivered while they occupied the very same residence. This relentless stream of articulate criticism was deliberately designed to shatter their self-esteem and keep them entirely dependent on his rare, fleeting approval. As his paranoia and intense jealousy deepened over the years, he frequently forced his partners into severe geographical isolation to completely control their daily environments. By deliberately relocating from the bustling heart of the London artistic scene to remote, quiet countryside estates, he effectively severed their essential ties to supportive friends. He constructed a beautiful rural prison where he could closely monitor their interactions and ensure he remained the absolute center of their isolated universe. His specific version of the infamous Othello syndrome manifested through wild, utterly baseless accusations of romantic betrayal, constantly projecting his own profound insecurities onto his exhausted partners. The atmosphere within his opulent homes was consistently described as incredibly suffocating, demanding that his wives walk on delicate eggshells to avoid triggering his legendary temper. He demanded an impossibly pure devotion while treating his chosen companions with an astonishing lack of basic human respect. Ultimately, his relentless need to crush the vibrant spirits of the women he initially adored left a permanent trail of immense sorrow and deep psychological scars. He remained completely unrepentant until his final days, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the devastating emotional cages he had meticulously constructed for his loyal partners. The theatrical world continues to study his groundbreaking plays, conveniently separating his undeniable artistic triumphs from the haunting reality of his silent, captive muses. Laurence Olivier, widely revered as the absolute titan of the British stage and screen during the 20th century, his name became entirely synonymous with theatrical perfection. He commanded profound respect from audiences and peers alike, projecting an aura of unmatched classical majesty. Yet, the grand curtain of his public persona concealed a deeply complex and controlling dynamic within his most famous romantic union. His intense passion for his legendary second wife eventually morphed into a gilded cage. When their legendary romance blossomed in the late 1930s, it was hailed as the ultimate pairing of two spectacular artistic forces. However, his profound need to be the undisputed master of his domain quickly cast a heavy, suffocating shadow over their shared lives. He harbored a deep, silent jealousy of her meteoric rise to international cinematic fame, privately viewing her monumental successes as a direct challenge to his established position as the supreme acting authority. To manage his own deeply rooted insecurities, he masked his fierce possessiveness under the guise of providing essential professional guidance and emotional protection. He meticulously dictated the roles she should accept, effectively curating her career to ensure she never permanently eclipsed his own theatrical legacy. If she received more thunderous applause or glowing reviews, the atmosphere within their opulent residence would dramatically shift into a chilling, resentful, and silent void. As her own emotional struggles began to profoundly deepen, his reaction was not to offer boundless, unconditional support, but rather to tighten his absolute grip on her daily existence. He strictly controlled her social interactions, carefully monitoring who she communicated with and severely limiting her access to outside confidants. This profound isolation was his preferred method of managing a fiercely independent spirit that he desperately loved, yet simultaneously feared he could not tame. The immense pressure of maintaining the flawless public facade of the ultimate theatrical couple slowly eroded her fragile spirit. She found herself permanently trapped within a beautifully decorated emotional prison, desperately trying to satisfy the relentless demands of a man who required absolute, unquestioning devotion. His brooding jealousy extended beyond professional rivalry, creating an environment where she constantly had to prove her ultimate loyalty to him above all other earthly pursuits. Their legendary union eventually collapsed under the unbearable weight of his suffocating expectations and her desperate need for genuine freedom. He moved forward to establish new, more compliant domestic arrangements, forever protecting his undisputed status as a theatrical deity. The world continued to bow before his magnificent, commanding performances, entirely overlooking the tragic reality that his most dramatic, controlling, and destructive role was played entirely behind closed doors. Mick Jagger. The ultimate symbol of musical rebellion and limitless freedom throughout the 1960s and 70s, projected an image of entirely uninhibited passion. Millions idolized his flamboyant stage presence and his blatant disregard for traditional boundaries. However, the women who fell into his intoxicating orbit discovered a shocking hypocrisy. The champion of free love was, behind locked doors, a fiercely possessive patriarch who demanded absolute fidelity while freely offering absolutely none in return. During the earliest days of his global ascent, he expected his companions to remain subservient to his rapidly expanding ego. He would strictly dictate their wardrobes, harshly forbidding them from wearing anything that might attract the eyes of other men. While he indulged in endless romantic conquests on international tours, his partner was instructed to wait patiently at their shared residence, functioning merely as a beautiful, silent, and entirely loyal anchor to his remarkably chaotic life. When he entered into a highly publicized marriage during the early 1970s with a fiercely independent socialite, his need for domestic control clashed violently with her vibrant spirit. He harbored a deep, hypocritical jealousy, monitoring her social interactions with an intense suspicion. If she dared to dance with a male friend at a prominent gathering, his legendary charisma would instantly vanish, replaced by a cold, punishing fury that terrified everyone in their immediate, curated circle. His specific brand of the Othello syndrome was rooted in a profound double standard that slowly destroyed the self-esteem of the women he claimed to adore. He viewed his own endless indiscretions as an essential component of his persona, yet he treated any sign of independence from his wives as an unforgivable betrayal. He isolated them from their support networks, ensuring they were entirely reliant on his immense wealth and his incredibly unpredictable flashes of romantic affection. The psychological toll of navigating this beautifully gilded but emotionally desolate cage drove several of his most famous partners to the absolute brink of despair. They were forced to endure the profound humiliation of his public affairs whilst being subjected to his relentless interrogations within the privacy of their opulent estates. He manipulated their emotional attachment, weaponizing his fame to convince them that enduring his control was the necessary price for sharing a life with a living legend. Ultimately, his possessiveness and blatant refusal to offer the loyalty he demanded guaranteed the bitter collapse of his romances. The world continues to celebrate his energetic youth and his revolutionary musical contributions that fundamentally changed the global landscape. Yet, the history of his private unions remains a stark testament to a man who demanded absolute freedom for himself, whilst forcing his loyal partners to live under the deeply jealous and incredibly rigid rules of a domestic tyrant.